The carriage jolted hard, and Alara Whitmore gripped the seat as the wheels struck the frozen ruts of the road leading to Ashcombe Manor. She was not crying. She had promised herself she would not cry, not on this day, not in front of strangers who already thought little of her. Her father's debts had bought her this marriage, and in less than an hour she would stand before a man who had made it clear, through every letter and every silence, that he did not want her. The manor rose out of the mist like a warning. Gray stone, tall windows, and not a single light burning in welcome. Alara stepped down from the carriage with her chin lifted, though her hands trembled inside her gloves. A row of servants stood waiting on the steps, their faces polite and unreadable. At the center of them stood Duke Sebastian Ashcombe, tall and still, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder as though she were a piece of furniture being delivered rather than a bride arriving. "Your Grace," Alara said, and dipped into a proper curtsy. Sebastian's gaze flicked to her for one brief moment. "You are late," he said, and turned to walk inside. No greeting, no offered arm. Alara stood alone on the steps for a heartbeat, feeling the cold settle deeper into her chest than the winter air ever could. Then a woman in a dark gray dress stepped forward, her expression not unkind but not warm either. "I am Mrs. Nora Pemberton, the housekeeper," she said. "Come inside, my lady. The wind bites worse the longer you stand in it." Alara followed her through the great doors, and the sound of them closing behind her felt final, like the closing of a book she had not been allowed to read. The wedding took place 2 hours later in the manor's private chapel, with only a handful of witnesses. There was no music, no flowers beyond a single arrangement someone had placed out of duty rather than joy. Sebastian repeated his vows in a flat, practiced voice, his eyes never once meeting hers. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian did not smile. He simply nodded, as though a business transaction had been completed, and walked out of the chapel before Alara had even risen from her knees. That night Alara ate dinner alone in a dining room built for 20 guests. The candles cast long shadows across the empty chairs. A servant informed her that His Grace was dining in his study and did not wish to be disturbed. Alara nodded, thanked the servant, and ate her meal in silence, listening to the wind press against the windows. She had known, of course, that this marriage was not born of affection. Her father had explained it to her plainly, without apology, the week before the wedding was announced. The Whitmore family owed a debt to the Ashcombe estate that could ruin them within a year. The Duke, in turn, needed a wife to satisfy the terms of his own late father's will, which required him to marry before his 30th birthday or forfeit a significant portion of his inheritance to a distant cousin. It was, her father had said, a fair arrangement for both families. Alara had not been asked whether she agreed. She had simply been told to prepare. What she had not expected was the depth of Sebastian's indifference. She had imagined coldness, certainly. She had not imagined being treated as though she did not exist at all. Over the following days, Alara began to understand the shape of her new life. Sebastian left the manor early each morning to oversee estate business, or so the servants told her, and returned late in the evening, often after Alara had already retired. When their paths did cross in the halls, he offered a curt nod and nothing more. He did not ask how she had settled in. He did not ask if she was comfortable, if she was lonely, if she had everything she needed. He simply moved through his days as though she were a guest who had overstayed her welcome, rather than the woman who now bore his name. The staff, taking their cues from their master, treated her with careful distance. They were not cruel, but neither were they warm. Meals were served on time. Rooms were cleaned. But no one consulted her on the running of the household, though that duty should have fallen to her as Duchess. Decisions about the menus, the linens, the arrangement of the sitting rooms, all continued to pass through Mrs. Pemberton and the steward, Mr. Elias Grant, exactly as they had before Alara's arrival, as though her title were a formality with no weight behind it. On her 5th night at Ashcombe Manor, Alara sat by the window of her bedchamber, watching the moon rise over the frost-covered gardens below. She thought of writing to her sister, Margaret, to describe the manor, the cold beauty of the grounds, the silence that filled every room. But she could not find the words that would not also reveal how alone she felt, and she did not want her family to worry, not when there was nothing to be done about it. Instead, she thought of her mother, who had died when Alara was 12, and who had once told her that dignity was the one thing no one could take from a woman unless she gave it away herself. Alara held onto that thought as she undressed for bed. She would not beg for her husband's attention. She would not chase a man who had made his indifference so plain. Whatever this marriage was, she would meet it with her head held high, even if no one in the manor ever noticed. The following morning, Alara rose early, dressed without waiting for a maid to assist her, and walked the halls of Ashcombe Manor on her own for the first time. She wanted to understand this place that was now, in name if nothing else, her home. She passed portraits of stern ancestors, their painted eyes following her down long corridors. She found a library with shelves that reached the ceiling, half the books coated in a fine layer of dust, as though no one had opened them in years. She found a music room with a piano that had clearly not been played in some time, its lid closed and its bench pushed neatly against the wall. In the east wing, she came upon a portrait unlike the others, hung slightly apart from the family gallery, in a smaller room that seemed set aside for it alone. The woman in the painting had golden hair and a soft, gentle smile, and something about the careful placement of the portrait, the single chair positioned before it, told Alara this was not simply another ancestor. She did not ask anyone about it, not yet, but she remembered the face, and she remembered the strange stillness of the room, as though it were a place meant for mourning rather than display. Later that day, Alara encountered Mrs. Pemberton in the corridor near the kitchens and asked, as gently as she could, whether she might be permitted to look over the household accounts, simply to familiarize herself with the running of the estate. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, glancing toward the study door as though seeking permission from someone who was not there. "His Grace has always managed such matters through Mr. Grant, my lady," she said carefully. "I do not think he would object to you looking them over, but I could not say for certain." "Then I shall ask him myself," Alara said, though she suspected, even as she said it, that the opportunity to ask him anything might not come easily. She was right. 3 more days passed before she saw Sebastian at all outside of brief, wordless moments in the hallway. On the 4th evening, she found him in the drawing room after dinner, reading by the fire, and gathered her courage to approach him. "Your Grace," she said, "I wondered if I might speak with you about the household accounts. I would like to understand how the estate is managed if it would not trouble you." Sebastian did not look up from his book immediately. When he finally did, his expression was distant, almost surprised that she had spoken to him at all. "Mr. Grant handles all of that. There is no need for you to trouble yourself with it." "It is not trouble," Alara said. "I would simply like to be useful." "You need not be useful," Sebastian said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a flat finality that was somehow worse than cruelty. "You need only be present. That is what the arrangement requires." The words settled over Alara like a weight she had not expected, though perhaps she should have. She had known this marriage was a matter of convenience, but hearing it stated so plainly, so carelessly, struck harder than she was prepared for. She said nothing further. She simply nodded, wished him a good evening, and left the room before he could see how deeply his words had landed. That night, alone in her chamber, Alara did not cry, though the temptation was stronger than it had been since her arrival. Instead, she sat at the small writing desk by the window and made a decision. She would not ask again. She would not seek his approval for how she spent her days, nor wait for his attention like a candle left burning for someone who had no intention of coming home. If Sebastian wished to treat her as a formality, then she would carry herself with the quiet composure of a woman who needed nothing from him at all. The next morning, without asking anyone's permission, Alara began her own quiet study of the estate. She walked the grounds and spoke with the gardeners. She visited the kitchens and asked the cook, a warm, round-faced woman named Bethan Rowe, about the meals prepared for the tenant families during the harsh winter months. She learned, gently and without announcing her intentions, the names of the people who worked within these walls, the small details of their lives that no one had ever thought to share with her, simply because no one had ever thought to ask. Word did not travel quickly to Sebastian, who remained locked away in his study or absent from the manor entirely for long stretches of each day. But it traveled among the staff, quietly, the way such things always did. The new Duchess did not complain. She did not demand. She simply watched and listened and began, in small and careful ways, to make herself known in a household that had been prepared to overlook her entirely. Alara did not know, on that cold morning as she walked the frost-covered paths of the garden alone, that her silence would prove far louder than any protest she might have made. She only knew that she would not break herself trying to be seen by a man who had already decided not to look. And in that quiet decision, though she could not have guessed it yet, the first thread of something far larger than either of them had begun to shift. Winter deepened over Ashcombe Manor, and with it came a routine that Alara built for herself out of necessity rather than comfort. She woke early before the rest of the household stirred, and spent her mornings walking the grounds regardless of the cold. It was during one of these walks, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, that she first met the Collier family, tenant farmers whose small cottage sat near the edge of the eastern fields. She had not meant to intrude. She had simply followed a narrow path through the frost, curious about the thin trail of smoke rising from a distant chimney, and found herself standing before a modest home, where a woman was struggling to carry an armful of firewood while a young boy coughed weakly in the doorway behind her. "Let me help you," Alara said, and before the woman could protest, she had already taken half the load from her arms. The woman, whose name was Hannah Collier, stared at her with wide, startled eyes. "My lady, you should not trouble yourself. This is not fitting work for a duchess." "I am simply a person with 2 working arms," Alara said, and something in her tone, warm despite the cold morning, made Hannah Collier's shoulders ease. Inside the small cottage, Alara learned that the boy, Hannah's youngest son, had been ill for nearly a week with a fever that would not break. The family had no money for a physician, and the estate steward had not yet visited to arrange for the seasonal provisions that tenant families were owed each winter. Alara said little at the time, only offered what comfort she could, and promised to see what might be done. But she left the cottage with a clear sense of purpose forming in her chest, sharper than anything she had felt since arriving at Ashcombe Manor. That afternoon, she sought out Mr. Elias Grant, the estate steward, in his office near the stables. He was a thin, careful man who kept meticulous records but rarely looked up from them. "Mr. Grant," Alara said, "I understand the tenant families are owed provisions each winter. I visited the Collier family this morning, and it seems they have not yet received theirs." Mr. Grant's pen paused mid-stroke. He glanced up at her, clearly uncertain how to respond to a duchess who had apparently walked the tenant lands unaccompanied. "The provisions are typically arranged through His Grace's approval, my lady. I had not yet received instruction for this season." "Then I am instructing you now," Alara said, keeping her voice steady and pleasant, though her heart beat quickly at her own boldness. "The Collier boy is ill, and I do not believe His Grace would wish for any family on this estate to go without care during the winter months. Please see that it is arranged by the end of the week." Mr. Grant studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of respect he had not shown her before. "Of course, my lady, I will see to it myself." It was a small victory, but Alara carried it with her for the rest of the day like a warm coal held close to her chest. For the first time since her wedding, she had done something that mattered, something that had nothing to do with waiting for Sebastian's approval or attention. She did not mention the matter to him. She suspected, rightly, that he would not have noticed either way. 3 days later, the provisions were delivered to the Collier family. Along with a physician, Alara had quietly arranged to visit at her own expense, using a small allowance her mother had left her before she died. The boy's fever broke within days. Word of the young duchess's kindness spread quickly through the tenant lands, carried from cottage to cottage the way good news always traveled faster than anyone expected. Sebastian remained largely unaware of these developments, consumed as he was by matters of his own. He spent long hours in his study reviewing correspondence related to a shipping venture the estate had invested in, and longer hours still avoiding the east wing of the manor entirely, where a certain portrait hung in a room he had not entered in over a year. It was Mrs. Pemberton who first mentioned Lady Clara Ainsworth to Alara, though she had not meant to. The two women had fallen into an easy rhythm over the following weeks, discussing household matters with growing familiarity, and one evening, while reviewing linen inventories together in the small parlor off the kitchen, Mrs. Pemberton let slip a name that made her pause and correct herself immediately. "Forgive me, my lady, I misspoke," she said quickly, though the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. "Who is Lady Clara Ainsworth?" Alara asked gently, sensing the older woman's discomfort but unwilling to let the question pass entirely unasked. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. "She was a young lady His Grace was very close to before you arrived. There was an understanding between them, though nothing was ever formally announced. She died nearly 2 years ago in a boating accident on the lake near her family's estate. His Grace has not been the same since." Alara said nothing, but the pieces of the manor's strange stillness began to fall into place around her. The portrait in the east wing, the empty music room, the way Sebastian moved through the halls as though carrying a weight no one else could see. She did not feel anger toward a woman she had never met, only a quiet, aching sympathy, and beneath it, an uncomfortable understanding of just how impossible her own position truly was. She had not simply married a man who did not want her. She had married a man who was still mourning someone else entirely. That knowledge did not soften the sting of Sebastian's coldness, but it did change the shape of it in her mind. Grief, she understood, could make a person cruel in ways they did not intend, could hollow out spaces where warmth should have lived. She resolved, quietly and without announcing it even to herself in so many words, that she would not compete with a memory. She would simply continue building the life she had already begun to build, brick by careful brick, whether Sebastian noticed it or not. The arrival of Edmund Ashcombe, Sebastian's distant cousin, disturbed the fragile calm of the manor less than a month later. Edmund arrived unannounced on a gray afternoon, his carriage far grander than necessity required, and his manner even grander still. He was a tall man with an easy, practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes, and from the moment he stepped through the doors of Ashcombe Manor, Alara felt an instinctive wariness she could not fully explain. "So this is the new Duchess," Edmund said, bowing over her hand with exaggerated courtesy. "Sebastian did not tell me you were so lovely. Though I suppose he tells me very little these days." "You are too kind, sir," Alara said carefully, withdrawing her hand as soon as politeness allowed. Edmund's visit, ostensibly meant to congratulate his cousin on his marriage, seemed to Alara to carry a different purpose entirely. He asked pointed questions about the estate's finances at dinner, questions Sebastian answered with clipped, guarded responses. He inquired with feigned casualness about the terms of the late Duke's will, and whether Sebastian's marriage had been finalized in time to satisfy its conditions in full. Alara noticed the tension that settled over Sebastian's shoulders each time his cousin spoke, though he masked it well enough that a less observant woman might not have caught it at all. Later that evening, after Edmund had retired to his guest chambers, Alara found herself alone with Sebastian in the drawing room for the first time in weeks, both of them lingering by the fire though neither had spoken to the other in some time. "Your cousin seems very interested in the estate," Alara said carefully, unsure whether Sebastian would welcome the observation or dismiss it as he dismissed most things she offered. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Edmund has always believed the title should have passed to him. My father's will was very specific in its conditions, and Edmund has never forgiven the fact that I met them and he did not benefit." "Do you trust him?" Alara asked. "I trust no one entirely," Sebastian said, and though his voice was flat, there was something almost like weariness beneath it, a crack in the armor Alara had not heard before. "But I trust Edmund least of all." It was the longest conversation they had shared since her arrival, and though it ended there, with Sebastian rising and bidding her a curt good night before retreating to his study, Alara found herself turning the moment over in her mind long after she had returned to her own chamber. He had spoken to her, however briefly, as though her opinion held some small weight. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was something, a single thread in a tapestry that had until now been entirely blank. Edmund's visit lasted 4 days in total, and by the time his carriage rolled away from the manor, Alara had grown certain of 2 things. The first was that Edmund Ashcombe was not a man to be trusted, that his smiles concealed calculations she could not yet fully see. The second was that Sebastian, for all his coldness toward her, was not a man without feeling. He simply kept his feelings buried beneath layers of grief and duty so thick that even he seemed to have forgotten how to reach them. In the weeks that followed, Alara continued her quiet work throughout the estate, visiting tenant families, reviewing accounts alongside Mr. Grant despite Sebastian's earlier dismissal, and slowly earning the trust of a household that had once regarded her as little more than a formality. She did not seek recognition for any of it. She did what needed doing because it needed doing, and because the alternative, sitting idle in a cold manor waiting for a husband who would not come, was not a life she was willing to accept. Sebastian, though he said nothing of it directly, began to notice small changes around the manor that he could not immediately explain. The tenant families seemed less strained during his infrequent visits to the estate's outer lands. The household accounts, when he glanced over them, showed careful, sensible adjustments he had not authorized but could not fault. The staff, once formal and distant with each other, seemed to move through their days with a lighter, more settled rhythm. He did not yet connect these changes to his wife, whom he still saw only in passing, whose presence in the manor remained, in his mind, little more than the fulfillment of a legal obligation. But the manor itself was changing around him, quietly and steadily, in ways he could feel even if he could not yet name their cause. And somewhere beneath the grief he carried like a stone in his chest, something small and unfamiliar had begun to stir, though he was not yet ready to look at it directly, let alone understand what it meant. Spring arrived slowly at Ashcombe Manor, thawing the frost from the gardens, but doing little to thaw the distance that still lingered between husband and wife. Alara had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her days, filled with quiet purpose even without her husband's notice. But she had not grown accustomed to the loneliness that crept in during the long evenings when the manor fell silent, and she sat alone with only her thoughts for company. It was during this season that the invitation arrived for the annual spring gathering hosted by Lord and Lady Whitfield, a grand affair attended by nearly every notable family in the county. Sebastian informed Alara of the event with the same flat detachment he used for most matters concerning her, sliding the invitation across the breakfast table without looking up from his correspondence. "We are expected to attend," he said. "It would reflect poorly on the family if we did not." "Of course," Alara said, folding the invitation carefully and setting it beside her plate. "I will see that I am prepared." She spent the following days arranging a gown, though she had little enthusiasm for the task. She suspected, correctly, that the gathering would be less a celebration and more a performance, a stage upon which the county's finest families would study her, judge her, and whisper about the strange, distant marriage between the Duke and his new Duchess. She had heard, through Mrs. Pemberton, that rumors had already begun to circulate, carried by servants and guests who had visited the manor, and noted the coldness between its master and mistress. The evening of the gathering arrived with a clear sky and a chill that had not entirely left the air. Alara dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue, simple but elegant, and arrived at the Whitfield estate on Sebastian's arm, though the arm he offered felt more like an obligation than an invitation. The grand ballroom glittered with candlelight and the low murmur of 100 conversations, and Alara felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes settle upon her the moment she crossed the threshold. "There she is," she heard a woman whisper nearby, not quite quietly enough. "The Whitmore girl. I hear the Duke barely speaks to her." Alara kept her expression composed, her chin lifted in the same manner it had been the day she first arrived at Ashcombe Manor. She had learned, over the months of her marriage, that dignity was a shield far sturdier than any defense she might offer in words. She smiled politely at those who greeted her, exchanged pleasant but brief conversation with the ladies who approached out of curiosity rather than genuine warmth, and refused to let the whispers that followed her through the ballroom show on her face. Sebastian, for his part, drifted away from her side almost immediately, drawn into conversation with a group of gentlemen discussing matters of trade and politics. Alara watched him go without protest, though something in her chest tightened at how easily he left her standing alone in a room full of strangers. It was Lady Amelia Prescott, a woman perhaps 10 years her senior with a sharp wit and an even sharper gaze, who first approached Alara with something resembling genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. "You handle the stairs rather well," Lady Amelia said, settling beside Alara near the refreshment table. "Most young brides in your position would have wilted by now." "I have found that wilting accomplishes very little," Alara said, and something in her tone made Lady Amelia laugh, a short, surprised sound. "No, I suppose it does not," Lady Amelia agreed. "Tell me, is it true the Duke barely speaks to you? The county has been buzzing with the tale for months." Alara considered her answer carefully. She could have denied it, could have offered some polite fiction about a marriage that was, in truth, warmer than it appeared. But she had grown weary of pretense, and something about Lady Amelia's directness invited an honesty Alara rarely allowed herself in public. "My husband carries a great deal of grief," Alara said simply. "I do not think it is my place to speak of his heart to strangers, even kind ones, but I will say that I have chosen not to spend my days waiting for attention I cannot control. I have found other ways to occupy my time." Lady Amelia studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into her expression. "That is a rare kind of wisdom for someone so young. Most women in your position would have made themselves miserable trying to win a man who has already decided not to be one. You seem to understand that misery is a choice, not a requirement." The conversation, brief as it was, planted something in Alara that she carried with her for the rest of the evening, a quiet reassurance that her chosen path, however lonely, was not a foolish one. She continued through the gathering with renewed composure, and though the whispers did not entirely cease, she noticed a subtle shift in the way some of the guests regarded her, a grudging admiration creeping into glances that had begun the evening as pity. It was near the end of the gathering that the evening took a sharper turn. Edmund Ashcombe, who had arrived separately and spent much of the night circulating among the county's most influential families, approached Alara with his usual practiced smile, though something colder lingered beneath it this time. "My lady," he said, bowing slightly, "I do hope married life suits you, even if my cousin's attention seems to lie elsewhere these days." "Married life suits me well enough," Alara said evenly, refusing to let his words find their mark. "Does it?" Edmund's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "I only ask because there has been some talk, quiet talk of course, about the timing of your wedding. My uncle's will was very specific about the conditions Sebastian needed to meet before his 30th birthday. Some wonder whether the marriage was arranged with quite the haste the law requires, or whether certain documents were, shall we say, adjusted to fit the circumstances." Alara felt a flash of cold anger beneath her composed exterior, understanding immediately the insinuation Edmund was making, not to her directly, but to anyone nearby who might overhear and carry the rumor further. She kept her voice steady, though every word cost her effort. "I would be careful, sir, about the talk you choose to spread," she said quietly. "Rumors have a way of returning to those who plant them, especially when they concern matters that could easily be verified by anyone with access to the proper records." Something flickered across Edmund's face, a brief flash of surprise at her steadiness, quickly smoothed back into his practiced smile. "Of course, my lady, I meant no offense, simply idle curiosity." He bowed and moved away, leaving Alara standing alone with her heart pounding beneath her composed exterior. She had not expected such a direct challenge, and though she had held her ground, she understood now, with startling clarity, that Edmund's ambitions ran deeper than simple resentment. He was searching for a weakness, a crack in the foundation of Sebastian's marriage, and title that he could exploit for his own gain, and she had just become, whether she wished it or not, a central piece on his board. She said nothing of the exchange to Sebastian on the carriage ride home, watching him instead as he stared silently out the window, lost in thoughts she could not guess at. It was only when they arrived back at the manor, and Sebastian moved to retire immediately to his study as was his habit, that Alara finally spoke. "Your cousin spoke to me tonight," she said. "He suggested there was talk about the legitimacy of our marriage timing, in relation to your father's will." Sebastian stopped mid-stride, turning to face her fully for perhaps the first time since their wedding day. "What exactly did he say?" Alara recounted the conversation as precisely as she could remember it, watching as Sebastian's expression darkened with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Edmund has wanted this title for years," he said finally. "He will use any means available to cast doubt on my claim to it. I should have expected he would eventually turn his attention toward you, given that our marriage is the very thing that secured my inheritance in the first place." "Is there any truth to what he implied?" Alara asked, not out of doubt, but out of a genuine need to understand the danger they might be facing. "None," Sebastian said firmly. "Every document was filed properly, every condition met exactly as required. But truth has never stopped Edmund from causing trouble when trouble suits his purposes." For a moment, standing in the dim candlelight of the entrance hall, something passed between them that had not existed before. A shared understanding, however small, that they now faced something together rather than separately. Sebastian's gaze lingered on her longer than it had in months, as though seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time since she had arrived at his door. "You handled him well," he said quietly. "Most people find Edmund difficult to stand against." "I have had practice standing against difficult people," Alara said, and though she meant it lightly, something in her tone carried the weight of every silent dinner, every unanswered question, every night she had spent alone in a manner that had not yet learned to welcome her. Sebastian did not respond to the implication, though a flicker of something crossed his face, gone before Alara could name it. He bid her good night and retreated to his study as he always did, leaving her once again alone in the quiet hall. But as she climbed the stairs to her chamber that night, Alara carried with her a small, fragile sense of progress, the first true acknowledgement she had received from her husband since the day they married. She did not know that Sebastian remained awake long after she had retired, sitting in his study with Edmund's insinuations turning over in his mind, alongside something else entirely, a growing awareness of the woman he had married and largely ignored, a woman who had faced his cousin's calculated cruelty with more grace and strength than he had shown her in the months since their wedding. It was not love, not yet, not even close. But it was the first crack in a wall he had built so carefully around himself that he had almost forgotten it was there at all. In the days that followed, Alara noticed a subtle shift in Sebastian's behavior, small and easily missed by anyone not paying close attention. He began asking, on occasion, how her days were spent. He inquired once briefly about the tenant families she had been visiting, though he did not comment further when she described the Collier family and the provisions she had arranged. He did not seek her out often, and their conversations remained brief and formal, but the wall between them had shifted, however slightly, and Alara found herself daring, for the first time since her wedding day, to hope that it might continue to shift further still. Yet even as this fragile progress took shape, Edmund's whispers continued to spread through the county, quiet and persistent, planting seeds of doubt that Alara feared would eventually demand a reckoning neither she nor Sebastian was fully prepared to face. The weeks following the gathering at the Whitfield estate brought a quiet unease to Ashcombe Manor, though little of it showed on the surface. Sebastian grew more withdrawn than before, spending long hours reviewing old documents and correspondence, searching for any weakness Edmund might attempt to exploit. Alara, though she was not invited into these efforts directly, sensed the tension and resolved to make herself useful in whatever ways remained open to her. It was during one of her regular reviews of the household accounts with Mr. Grant, a practice she had continued despite Sebastian's earlier dismissal, that she noticed a discrepancy that struck her as significant. A payment recorded to a merchant in the county, dated several months before her arrival, did not match the corresponding entry in the estate's ledger of goods received. The amounts were close enough that a careless reader might overlook the difference entirely, but Alara had spent enough hours poring over these records to notice patterns, and this one did not fit. "Mr. Grant," she said, setting the ledger before him, "this entry troubles me. The payment recorded here does not align with the goods listed as received. Do you recall this transaction?" Mr. Grant frowned, studying the pages carefully. "This predates my time managing the accounts directly, my lady. This would have been handled by the previous steward before His Grace's father passed. I confess I had not noticed the discrepancy myself." Alara considered the matter for a long moment. On its own, the discrepancy might have been dismissed as a simple clerical error, the kind of small mistake that occurred in any large estate's records over the years. But given Edmund's recent insinuations about the legitimacy of documents connected to the family's affairs, Alara felt a growing unease that such an error, however innocent, could be twisted into something far more damaging if it fell into the wrong hands. "I think it wise that we resolve this quietly, before anyone else has cause to examine these records too closely," she said. "Could we trace the original transaction and confirm what actually occurred?" Mr. Grant nodded slowly, clearly impressed by her thoroughness. "I will make inquiries, my lady. It may take some days, but I believe we can uncover the truth of it." True to his word, Mr. Grant spent the following week tracing the transaction through old correspondence and the records of the merchant involved. A man named Thomas Ellery, who had long since retired from trade, but still kept careful records of his own. It emerged, eventually, that the discrepancy was indeed a simple error, a miscounted shipment of building materials used in repairs to the manor's eastern wall many years before, the kind of mistake that happened easily in the chaos of a large renovation project. But the process of uncovering the truth revealed something else entirely, a pattern of loose record-keeping throughout several years of the estate's history that, left unaddressed, could provide exactly the kind of ambiguity Edmund seemed eager to exploit. Alara brought her findings to Sebastian one evening, choosing her moment carefully, waiting until he had finished his dinner and settled into the drawing room with his customary glass of wine and a book he was not truly reading. "Your Grace," she said, "I have found something in the estate records that I believe you should know about." Sebastian looked up, his expression carrying the same distant politeness he usually offered her, though a flicker of curiosity crossed his face at her tone. "What have you found?" Alara explained the discrepancy she had uncovered, the process by which she and Mr. Grant had traced its origins, and her concern that similar gaps in the records, however innocent, could provide ammunition for anyone seeking to cast doubt on the estate's legitimacy. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his expression growing more focused with each detail she provided. "You did this on your own?" he asked when she finished. "With Mr. Grant's help, yes," Alara said. "I did not wish to trouble you with something that might amount to nothing, but given Edmund's recent comments, I thought it prudent to be thorough." Sebastian set down his book entirely now, studying her with an intensity she had not felt from him before. Most people would not have noticed such a small discrepancy at all, let alone traced it back through years of records to confirm its origin. "I have found that small things often matter more than they first appear," Alara said simply. "I would rather understand the ground I stand on than be surprised by a crack beneath my feet." Something in Sebastian's expression shifted then, a crack in his own carefully maintained distance. "Thank you," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight Alara had not heard from him before. "I did not expect this from you." "You did not expect much from me at all, Your Grace," Alara said, and though she kept her tone gentle rather than accusing, the truth of the words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Sebastian did not respond immediately, and for a long moment the two of them sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them. "No," he admitted finally. "I did not. I am beginning to see that was an error on my part." It was not an apology, not fully, but it was closer to one than anything he had offered her since their wedding day. And Alara carried the words with her long after she retired to her chamber that night, turning them over carefully, allowing herself the smallest flicker of hope that the wall between them might continue to soften. In the weeks that followed, Sebastian began involving Alara more directly in matters concerning the estate, though he did so cautiously, as though testing the boundaries of a trust he was not yet certain he was ready to extend. He asked her opinion on a proposed repair to the tenant cottages along the northern boundary of the estate, and when she suggested prioritizing the Collier family's roof, which had been damaged in a recent storm, he agreed without argument. He mentioned, almost in passing, a difficult decision regarding a trade agreement the estate had entered into years before, and though Alara knew little of trade matters, she listened carefully and offered what thoughtful questions she could, questions that seemed to help him clarify his own thinking even when she offered no direct answers. Their conversations remained formal, careful, neither of them quite ready to breach the distance that had defined their marriage from its earliest days. But the silences between them began to feel different, less like walls and more like spaces waiting to be filled. It was during this period that Alara also grew closer to the tenant families scattered across the estate's lands, spending her mornings visiting cottages, listening to concerns that had gone unheard for years, and quietly arranging solutions where she could. She helped negotiate better terms for a family struggling with a difficult harvest the previous autumn. She arranged for a young girl with a talent for reading to receive proper books and instruction, having noticed the child's quick mind during a visit to her family's cottage. She listened to complaints about a well that had run dry on the estate's western edge, and worked with Mr. Grant to arrange for its repair, before the matter grew serious enough to reach Sebastian's desk at all. None of this was done for recognition. Alara had long since stopped hoping for praise or gratitude from her husband, finding instead a quiet satisfaction in the work itself, in the sense that her presence at Ashcombe Manor had come to mean something real, even if that meaning had nothing to do with the man she had married. But recognition found her anyway, carried on the words of tenants and servants who spoke of the young Duchess with genuine warmth, words that eventually reached Sebastian's ears through channels he had not expected. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned it first, during a routine discussion of household matters. "The tenants speak very highly of her grace, your grace," she said carefully, watching Sebastian's reaction. "They say she has done more for their welfare in a few months than the estate managed in years before her arrival." Sebastian said little in response, but the words lodged themselves somewhere in his chest, alongside the growing unease he felt each time he considered how thoroughly he had misjudged the woman he had married. He began to watch Alara more closely after that, not with the wariness he had once carried, but with a curiosity he was not yet ready to name. He watched her during dinner, noting the quiet grace with which she conducted herself even in his continued distance. He watched her from his study window one afternoon as she walked toward the tenant cottages, her steps purposeful, her manner warm even from a distance. He began to notice, with something like discomfort, that the manor itself had changed since her arrival, had grown warmer and more alive in ways he could not entirely attribute to the changing seasons. It was a small moment, weeks later, that finally cracked something open in him more fully. He had ridden out early one morning to inspect a section of fence along the estate's boundary, and on his return, he passed near the Collier cottage and saw Alara there, seated on a low stool outside the small home, laughing gently at something the youngest Collier boy, now fully recovered from his illness, was telling her with great animation. She looked in that unguarded moment entirely at ease, entirely herself, in a way Sebastian realized he had never once seen at the manor, where his own coldness had kept her carefully composed and distant. He did not approach. He simply watched from a distance, something tightening in his chest that he could not fully identify, and rode on toward the manor with a growing, uncomfortable awareness that the woman he had married, the woman he had spent months largely ignoring, had built an entire life of quiet purpose and warmth directly beneath his notice, a life he had done nothing to earn a place within. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Sebastian sought Alara out not out of necessity, but simply to speak with her. He found her in the library, a book open in her lap though her attention seemed elsewhere, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "Your Grace," she said, rising slightly out of habit. "Please," he said, "there is no need to rise. I only wished to see how your day had gone." Alara studied him carefully, sensing the shift in his manner even before she fully understood its cause. "It went well," she said. "I visited the Collier family this morning. The youngest boy has made a full recovery." "I am glad to hear it," Sebastian said, and though the words were simple, something in his tone carried a sincerity she had not heard from him before. He lingered a moment longer, as though searching for something further to say, before finally offering a small nod and retreating toward his study. It was not much, this small exchange, but Alara sat with it long after he had gone, sensing that something had shifted within her husband, however slightly, however slowly. She did not yet know what it meant, or whether it would last, but she allowed herself, for the first time in months, to hope that the silence she had carried so carefully might finally be reaching the ears of the one person she had never expected to listen. The crisis arrived without warning, as crises so often do, on a night when Sebastian had traveled to London to attend to matters concerning the estate's shipping investments, a journey that was expected to keep him away for the better part of a week. Alara had grown used to his absences by then, though this one felt different somehow, a quiet unease settling over her that she could not fully explain, as though some part of her sensed trouble gathering on the horizon before it ever arrived. It was well past midnight when the cry went up from the eastern fields, carried across the dark grounds by a stable boy who had been checking on the horses, and noticed the glow of flame rising from the direction of the tenant cottages. Alara was still awake, unable to sleep, when she heard the commotion below her window, servants rushing through the halls, voices raised in alarm. She was dressed and downstairs within minutes, finding Mrs. Pemberton and several of the household staff gathered in the entrance hall, their faces pale with fear. "What has happened?" Alara demanded, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her own chest. "Fire, my lady," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Near the tenant cottages, close to the Collier family's home. We do not yet know how badly it has spread." Alara did not hesitate. "Send for every able hand on the estate. We will need water, blankets, and anyone who can help carry the injured. Has anyone gone to warn the families in that area?" "Not yet, my lady. The alarm has only just been raised." "Then we go now," Alara said, already moving toward the door. "Mrs. Pemberton, gather what medical supplies we have and follow as quickly as you can. I will go ahead to help with the evacuation." The ride to the eastern fields felt endless, the night air thick with the acrid smell of smoke long before the cottages came into view. When Alara arrived, the scene before her was chaos, flames climbing high from what had once been a storage barn adjacent to several tenant homes, sparks carried on the wind toward thatched roofs that could catch fire within moments if left unchecked. Families stood in the yard in their nightclothes, some clutching children, others frozen in shock at the sight of their homes threatened by the spreading blaze. Alara dismounted quickly and moved directly into the center of the chaos, her voice carrying clearly over the roar of the flames and the frightened cries of the gathered families. "Everyone listen to me," she called out. "We need a line from the well to the nearest cottage roofs now before the sparks catch. Anyone who can carry a bucket, form a line. The rest of you, help the children and the elderly move back toward the manor road, away from the smoke." For a moment no one moved, the shock of the situation holding them still. Then Hannah Collier, recognizing the Duchess who had once carried firewood into her home with her own hands, stepped forward first, grabbing a bucket and moving toward the well. "You heard her Grace," Hannah called out to the others. "Form the line." The response, once it began, moved quickly. Men and women who had spent their lives working the land fell into the rhythm of the bucket line with practiced efficiency, passing water hand to hand toward the cottages nearest the flames, dousing the thatched roofs before the drifting sparks could take hold. Alara moved among the families, helping an elderly man to his feet, guiding a group of frightened children away from the smoke, checking each face she passed for signs of injury. It was during this chaos that she found young Peter Collier, no older than 7, coughing badly and separated from his mother in the confusion, standing dangerously close to the edge of the fire's reach, transfixed by the flames in the way children sometimes were, too frightened to move on their own. "Peter," Alara said, crouching down to his level despite the danger, keeping her voice calm and steady though her heart pounded fiercely in her chest. "I need you to take my hand. Your mother is looking for you." The boy's small hand found hers, and Alara led him quickly away from the worst of the smoke, back toward the gathering point where Hannah Collier, spotting her son, cried out in relief and rushed forward to gather him into her arms. "Thank you, my lady," Hannah said, tears streaking down her soot-stained face. "Thank you." Alara had no time to respond before turning back toward the fire line, where the bucket brigade continued its steady work. Mrs. Pemberton arrived soon after with additional staff from the manor, bringing blankets, water, and a physician who had been roused from the nearby village. Alara directed the newly arrived help with the same calm authority she had shown from the start, ensuring the injured were tended to first, the displaced families given shelter and warmth, and the fire itself brought steadily under control as the night wore on. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, well past 3 in the morning, the storage barn had been lost entirely, but not a single cottage had burned, and not a single life had been lost. Several people had suffered minor injuries, burns and smoke inhalation among them, but the physician assured Alara that all would recover with proper care. She spent the remaining hours of the night moving among the affected families, offering comfort, arranging temporary shelter within the manor's outbuildings for those whose homes had been damaged by smoke, and ensuring that every person present had been accounted for and cared for before she finally allowed herself to rest. It was only as dawn broke over the smoldering remains of the barn that Alara finally sat down, exhaustion overtaking her all at once, and allowed herself to consider the strange, unsettling question that had been forming in the back of her mind throughout the long night. The fire had begun in the storage barn, a structure with no history of trouble, no obvious cause for such a sudden and fierce blaze. She said nothing of her suspicion to anyone that morning, too exhausted and too occupied with the immediate needs of the affected families to give the thought its full weight. But it lingered nonetheless, a small, cold seed of doubt that she could not quite shake. Sebastian returned from London 3 days later, arriving at the manor in the late afternoon to find the grounds humming with an unfamiliar energy. Tenant families still gathered near the manor's outbuildings, temporary repairs underway on the damaged sections of the eastern fields. He had heard nothing of the fire during his journey, and the sight before him struck him with an alarm he had not felt in a very long time. "What has happened here?" he demanded, finding Mr. Grant near the stables and dismounting quickly. "A fire, your grace, 3 nights past," Mr. Grant explained. "The storage barn near the Collier cottage was lost, but no lives and no homes beyond it. Her grace organized the response herself. If not for her quick action, the damage would have been far worse." Sebastian said nothing for a long moment, absorbing the information with a growing sense of disbelief. "She was here, in the middle of the fire." "From the very start, your grace. She led the bucket line herself, helped evacuate the families, and stayed through the night ensuring everyone was cared for. The tenants speak of little else." Sebastian found Alara later that evening, in the small parlor off the kitchen where she had taken to reviewing accounts with Mr. Grant. Though this evening she sat alone, her expression tired but composed, a light bandage wrapped around one hand where she had burned herself pulling a young child clear of falling debris during the height of the chaos. "Alara," Sebastian said, and something in the way he said her name without the formal title he usually attached to it made her look up in surprise. "I have heard what happened, what you did." It was simply what needed to be done, Alara said, echoing words she had said to him once before in a different context entirely. The families needed help and I was here. There was no decision to make, only action to take. Sebastian crossed the room and sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the bandage wrapped around her hand. You could have been badly hurt, worse than hurt. I was aware of the risk, Alara said simply. I chose to act regardless. Why? Sebastian asked, and the question carried a weight beyond its simple wording, as though he were asking something far larger than why she had helped fight a fire. Alara considered her answer carefully before speaking. Because they are my people too, Your Grace, whether you have chosen to see me as your wife in truth or not. This is my home now, whatever else it may or may not be, and I could not stand by while it burned. Something in Sebastian's expression cracked open fully then, a wall he had maintained for so long finally beginning to crumble under the weight of everything he had learned in her absence, everything he had seen in the state of the manor, and the words of the tenants who spoke of her with such reverence. I have done you a great disservice, he said quietly. From the very first day, I treated you as an obligation, a formality to be endured when you have proven yourself to be the very heart of this estate, more than I have managed to be in years. Alara said nothing for a long moment, uncertain how to respond to words she had waited so long to hear, uncertain whether to trust the sincerity behind them after so many months of careful, guarded distance. You do not owe me an apology tonight, Your Grace, she said finally. You are tired, and I am tired, and there will be time enough for such conversations when we are both able to give them the attention they deserve. Sebastian nodded slowly, though he did not rise to leave immediately as he usually did. He sat with her a while longer in the quiet parlor, the fire crackling softly between them, neither of them speaking further, but neither of them retreating either, and something in that shared silence felt, for the first time since their wedding day, less like a wall and more like the beginning of a bridge. It was only later, alone in his study that night, that Sebastian allowed himself to consider the darker thought that had been nagging at him since his return, a thought Alara had not yet voiced to him directly. A storage barn with no history of trouble did not simply catch fire on its own, not without some cause, and Edmund Ashcombe had been seen in the county only days before the blaze, his presence unremarked upon at the time but suddenly, in Sebastian's mind, deeply suspicious. He said nothing of this suspicion to anyone that night, but he resolved, quietly and firmly, to look more closely into the matter, understanding now, with a clarity that had been sorely missing from his conduct these past months, that there was far more at stake in his marriage and his estate than he had allowed himself to recognize. In the days following his return from London, Sebastian threw himself into a quiet investigation of the fire, careful not to raise alarm among the household while he pieced together what he could of the events leading up to that night. He spoke privately with the stable boy who had first raised the alarm, learning that the boy had noticed a stranger near the storage barn earlier that same evening, a man he did not recognize as belonging to the estate or the surrounding village. He spoke with the physician who had treated the injured, confirming that the burns and injuries were consistent with a fire that had spread unusually fast, faster than a barn filled with dry hay and old tools should have burned without some accelerant to hasten it. He said nothing of his suspicions to Alara at first, not wishing to burden her further after everything she had already carried through that long night. But as the days passed, and the evidence continued to point toward deliberate cause rather than accident, he found he could no longer keep the matter from her. He found her in the garden one afternoon, tending to a small section she had claimed for herself since her arrival, planting flowers that would not bloom until summer, and he watched her for a moment before approaching, struck again by how easily she moved through her days now, how thoroughly she had made a place for herself in a home that had once seemed determined to reject her. "Alara," he said, and she looked up, brushing soil from her gloves. "I have been looking into the cause of the fire." Something in his tone made her set down her tools entirely, giving him her full attention. "And what have you found?" "I believe it was deliberately set," Sebastian said. "A stranger was seen near the barn shortly before the blaze began, and the fire spread faster than it should have, given the conditions that night. I have my suspicions about who might be responsible, though I have no proof yet strong enough to act upon." "Edmund," Alara said quietly, and Sebastian's expression confirmed the thought before he spoke it aloud. "He was seen in the county only days before the fire," Sebastian said. "I do not yet know his purpose, whether it was meant to damage the estate's reputation, to create financial strain, or something else entirely. But I do not believe in coincidence, not when it comes to my cousin." Alara considered this carefully, her mind returning to the calculated cruelty she had witnessed from Edmund at the Whitfield gathering months before, the careful way he had planted doubt about the legitimacy of their marriage, the practiced smile that concealed something far colder beneath it. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to find proof," Sebastian said. "And when I have it, I intend to ensure Edmund never again has the opportunity to threaten this estate, or this family, or the people who depend on us for their safety." There was a new firmness in his voice, a resolve Alara had not heard from him before, and she recognized in it something that had shifted within him since the night of the fire, a man who had begun to understand what he stood to lose and had decided, finally, to fight for it. Over the following weeks, Sebastian and Alara worked together more closely than they ever had before, reviewing old correspondence, tracing Edmund's movements through the county, and quietly gathering testimony from those who had witnessed his presence near the estate in the days before the fire. It was slow, careful work, but it drew them together in a way neither of them had expected. Long evenings spent in the study poring over documents, quiet conversations that stretched later into the night than either of them intended, a growing familiarity that neither acknowledged directly but both felt taking shape between them. It was during one of these late evenings, the fire burned low in the study's hearth, and the manor silent around them, that Sebastian finally spoke of Clara Ainsworth. The name Alara had carried quietly in her mind since Mrs. Pemberton first mentioned it months before. "You have seen the portrait, I imagine," Sebastian said, not looking up from the papers before him. "In the East Wing." Alara set down the document she had been reviewing, sensing the significance of what he was about to share. "I have. Mrs. Pemberton told me a little of her, though I did not press for more." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Clara and I grew up together. Our families were close, and there was always an understanding between us, even before it was formally acknowledged. I loved her deeply, in the way one loves someone who has always simply been part of one's life. When she died, I did not know how to continue living in a world that no longer contained her." "I am sorry," Alara said softly, and she meant it fully without envy or resentment, only a genuine ache for the grief he had carried for so long, largely alone. "I did not want to marry again," Sebastian continued. "When my father's will forced my hand, I resented it deeply, resented the idea of building a life with someone who was not her, of pretending at a partnership I did not believe I could ever truly feel. I am ashamed to admit that I carried that resentment into our marriage, and that you bore the weight of grief that was never yours to carry." Alara considered her words carefully before speaking. "I understood, even before you told me, that I was not the wife you would have chosen for yourself. I did not resent you for grieving her. I only wished, sometimes, that you had allowed me the chance to be seen as myself, rather than simply measured against someone I could never replace, nor wished to." "I know that now," Sebastian said, finally turning to look at her fully. "I have watched you these past months, Alara, watched you build a life here entirely on your own, without any help or encouragement from me, watched you face my cousin's cruelty and a burning barn with more courage than I have managed to show in years. I do not compare you to Clara any longer. I find that I think of you now as entirely, wonderfully your own person, someone I am only beginning to understand I have grossly undervalued." The words settled over Alara with a warmth she had not expected, and though she said nothing immediately, the careful composure she had maintained for so many months wavered slightly, tears gathering unbidden at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "That means more to me than you may realize." They sat together in the quiet study a while longer, the distance between them smaller than it had been in all the months since their wedding, though neither of them reached across it fully, both aware that trust, once broken, required patience to rebuild rather than a single conversation to mend entirely. The investigation into Edmund's involvement in the fire continued in the weeks that followed, and it was during this period that a new danger revealed itself, one that struck far closer to Alara than either of them had anticipated. She had traveled into the nearby village one afternoon to purchase supplies for the tenant families still recovering from the fire's aftermath, accompanied only by a single manor servant, when a man she did not recognize approached her outside the small shop she had just left. "My lady," the man said, his tone falsely polite, his eyes carrying a coldness that made Alara's instincts sharpen immediately. "A word of advice, if I may. Some matters are best left buried. Continuing to dig into things that do not concern you could prove dangerous, for you and for those you care about." Before Alara could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the crowded street, leaving her shaken but composed enough to return to her carriage without drawing further attention. She said nothing to the servant accompanying her, but the moment she returned to the manor, she sought out Sebastian directly, recounting the encounter in careful detail. Sebastian's face darkened with a fury Alara had never seen from him before, a fierce protectiveness that startled her even as it warmed something deep within her chest. "This ends now," he said. "I will not allow Edmund to threaten you, whatever proof I have or have not yet gathered. I will confront him directly, and I will ensure he understands, in terms he cannot mistake, that any harm brought to you will be met with consequences he cannot survive within polite society, or beyond it if necessary." "Sebastian," Alara said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding, the intimacy of it startling them both. "I do not wish for you to act recklessly on my account. We must be careful and clever rather than simply angry." Something in her use of his name and the calm strength beneath her words even after such a frightening encounter seemed to steady him, his fury softening into a fierce, quiet resolve. "You are right," he said. "But know this, Alara. Whatever else stands unresolved between us, I will not allow anyone to threaten your safety. Not Edmund, not anyone. That much I am certain of." It was the clearest declaration he had yet made, not of love, not exactly, but of a protectiveness that carried within it the first true seeds of something neither of them had expected to grow between them, planted in the aftermath of fire and threat, nurtured slowly through months of quiet resilience and grudging respect that had, almost without either of them noticing, begun to blossom into something far warmer than either had believed possible on the cold morning Alara first arrived at Ashcombe Manor. The proof Sebastian had been searching for finally arrived nearly 3 weeks later, delivered by a private investigator he had quietly hired following the threat made against Alara in the village. The investigator, a careful and methodical man named Charles Whitby, presented Sebastian with signed testimony from the stranger seen near the storage barn on the night of the fire. A man who had been paid to set the blaze under instructions, relayed through an intermediary connected directly to Edmund Ashcombe. Further digging revealed that Edmund had also attempted to bribe a clerk within the county record's office to alter documents related to the timing of Sebastian's marriage, hoping to manufacture evidence that might support his earlier insinuations about the legitimacy of the union. Sebastian read through the evidence in his study late one evening, Alara seated across from him as she had been through so many of these difficult hours in recent weeks. And when he finished, he set the papers down with a controlled, quiet fury that Alara had come to recognize as far more dangerous than any outburst might have been. "He tried to burn tenant homes to create chaos he could exploit," Sebastian said. "He tried to threaten you into silence, and he tried to falsify records to steal a title that was never his by right. This is enough, more than enough, to end him entirely." "What will you do?" Alara asked. "There is a gathering at the county assembly next week," Sebastian said. "Many of the same families who witnessed his insinuations at the Whitfield gathering will be present. I intend to present this evidence publicly, before witnesses who cannot be dismissed or bought, and ensure that Edmund's reputation is destroyed as thoroughly as he attempted to destroy mine and yours. The county assembly, when the evening finally arrived, was a grand affair, though Alara found herself far less concerned with the finery of the gathering than with the confrontation she knew was coming. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep green that Sebastian had commented on with quiet admiration only days before, and arrived at the assembly hall on his arm, his hand steady and present in a way it had never been at the Whitfield gathering months earlier. Edmund arrived later than most, his usual confident smile firmly in place as he moved through the crowd, greeting acquaintances with practiced charm. He approached Sebastian and Alara near the center of the hall, apparently unaware of the evidence that had already been gathered against him. "Cousin," Edmund said, bowing slightly, "and the lovely Duchess, I trust married life continues to suit you both." "It suits us very well, Edmund," Sebastian said, his voice carrying a calm, dangerous edge that made several nearby guests pause their own conversations to listen more closely. "Though I understand you have taken quite an interest in our marriage these past months, an interest that extends rather further than idle curiosity." Edmund's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "I do not know what you mean." "I mean the man you paid to burn the storage barn near the tenant cottages," Sebastian said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the growing circle of guests now gathering around them, drawn by the tension in the air. "I mean the clerk you attempted to bribe to falsify records concerning my marriage. I mean the threat made against my wife in the village, warning her against continuing to investigate matters that concerned her deeply." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, dozens of eyes now fixed on Edmund, whose composure had begun to crack visibly beneath the weight of Sebastian's accusations. "These are serious claims," Edmund said, though his voice carried less confidence now than it had moments before. "I trust you have evidence to support such accusations, cousin, or you risk damaging your own reputation with baseless slander." "I have evidence," Sebastian said, and at his signal, Charles Whitby stepped forward from where he had been waiting near the edge of the hall, presenting a folder of documents that Sebastian took and held aloft, though he did not open it fully before the crowd, choosing instead to describe its contents with cold, precise clarity. "Signed testimony from the man you hired to set the fire. Records of the payment made through your intermediary. A statement from the clerk you attempted to bribe, who chose honesty over your coin once the matter was investigated properly. I have brought copies for the county magistrate, who I understand is present this evening." A tall, stern-faced man near the back of the hall stepped forward at this, and Alara recognized him as Magistrate Holloway, a man of considerable standing within the county. "I would be very interested in reviewing such evidence, Your Grace," the magistrate said. "If what you describe is accurate, these are matters of criminal concern, not simply a family dispute." Edmund's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away, replaced by a desperate, cornered anger. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "You would ruin your own family's name over such wild accusations, based on the testimony of hired men who would say anything for coin." "I would ruin nothing that was not already rotten," Sebastian said, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmuring crowd. "You endangered innocent families, Edmund. Children slept in those cottages that night. You threatened my wife's safety, a woman who has done nothing but strengthen this estate and care for the people within it since the day she arrived, more than you have ever contributed in all your years of resentment and scheming. Whatever claim you believed you had to this title, you have forfeited any shred of honor that might have supported it tonight." The hall had fallen almost entirely silent now, every guest present watching the confrontation unfold with rapt, uncomfortable attention. Alara stood beside Sebastian, her chin lifted in the same composed manner she had carried since her very first day at Ashcombe Manor, though this time, for the first time, she did not stand alone. Sebastian's hand found hers, steady and firm, a public acknowledgement of partnership that carried far more weight than any words could have offered in that moment. Magistrate Holloway stepped forward fully now, addressing Edmund directly. "Mr. Ashcombe, I will need you to accompany me to discuss this evidence further. If the claims presented tonight are substantiated, and given the credibility of the source presenting them, I expect they will be, you are facing serious criminal charges, arson and attempted fraud chief among them. Edmund looked around the hall, searching desperately for some ally among the gathered crowd, but found only cold, judging stares in return. The same families who had once entertained his whispered insinuations now recoiling from him entirely, understanding fully the depth of the scheme he had attempted to carry out. Without another word, he allowed himself to be led from the hall by the magistrate's men, his reputation, and any remaining claim to influence within the county, destroyed entirely before the very people whose opinion he had once valued so highly. The hall remained quiet for a long moment after Edmund's departure before conversation slowly began to resume, though every guest present now regarded Sebastian and Alara with a new, deeper respect than they had shown before. Lady Amelia Prescott approached them not long after, her expression carrying genuine warmth rather than mere curiosity. "Well handled, both of you," she said. "The county has needed someone to finally stand against that man for years. I am glad it was you." Sebastian thanked her graciously, though his attention remained largely fixed on Alara, who stood beside him with a quiet, exhausted relief settling over her features now that the confrontation had finally passed. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Sebastian guided Alara toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the remaining crowd. "You stood beside me tonight," he said softly, "after everything I failed to offer you in return for so many months. I do not know that I deserve such loyalty." "You defended me tonight, Sebastian," Alara said, using his given name easily now, the intimacy no longer startling either of them. "Publicly, without hesitation in front of the entire county. That is not nothing. That is everything I once feared I would never receive from you." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something in his gaze carrying a warmth and openness Alara had never seen from him before, not even in their most private conversations of recent weeks. "I have been a fool," he said quietly. "I built walls around my heart after Clara died, walls I told myself were protecting me, when in truth they were only keeping me from recognizing something extraordinary standing directly in front of me. I see you now, Alara, fully and clearly, and I find that what I see fills me with an admiration I do not know how to fully express." Alara felt her breath catch at his words, months of quiet loneliness and careful composure finally giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "you might simply continue trying to express it. I find I am willing to be patient if the effort is genuine." "It is," Sebastian said, his voice carrying a certainty she had never heard from him before. "I promise you, Alara, it is entirely genuine." They left the assembly hall together that night, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two people who had, through fire and threat and quiet resilience, finally begun to find their way toward one another, the long winter of their marriage giving way, at last, to the first true warmth of spring. In the weeks that followed Edmund's disgrace and removal from county society, Ashcombe Manor began to feel, for the first time since Alara's arrival, like a true home rather than a cold monument to duty and grief. Sebastian's transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but steady and deliberate, the careful unlearning of habits built over years of loss, replaced gradually with a warmth that seemed to surprise even him at times. He began joining Alara for breakfast each morning, a small ritual neither of them had shared before, filled with easy conversation about the day ahead rather than the strained silence that had once defined their meals together. He asked about her plans for the tenant families, offered his own suggestions when he had them, and listened, truly listened, when she spoke of her concerns and hopes for the estate they now clearly shared rather than simply occupied separately. It was on a warm afternoon in early summer that Sebastian found Alara in the garden once more, tending to the flowers she had planted months before, now finally beginning to bloom in earnest. He watched her for a moment, the same way he had months earlier, though the feeling in his chest now bore no resemblance to the distant curiosity he had felt then. It was something fuller, warmer, undeniable. "They are beautiful," he said, approaching slowly. "The flowers you planted." "They took their time," Alara said, smiling as she looked up at him. "But I find the wait made them all the more worth having once they finally bloomed." Sebastian understood the quiet metaphor in her words, and something in his chest tightened with the truth of it. "Alara," he said, "I have spent these past weeks trying to find the right way to tell you what I feel, and I find that simple words seem inadequate to the task. But I will try nonetheless. I love you. Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude for everything you have given this estate and its people, though I am deeply grateful for that as well. I love you because of who you are, the strength and grace and quiet wisdom you have shown me every single day since you arrived, even when I gave you no reason to stay, no reason to hope for anything more than the cold arrangement I offered you at first." Alara set down her gardening tools, rising to face him fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have loved you longer than I think I allowed myself to admit," she said softly. "Even in the coldest months, even when you barely looked at me, I saw glimpses of the man beneath the grief, and I found myself hoping, against my own better judgment, that he might one day let me in." "I have let you in," Sebastian said, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "Fully and without reservation. I want the world to know it, not simply through the defense I offered you at the assembly, but through every day that follows, for the rest of our lives together." He proposed in that quiet garden, not a second wedding, for they were already bound by law, but a renewal of their vows before the entire county. A public declaration that the marriage once viewed as cold and hollow had become something entirely different, something built on genuine devotion rather than mere obligation. Alara agreed without hesitation, and the following weeks were spent in joyful preparation, a stark contrast to the somber, hurried arrangements of their original wedding. The ceremony took place in early autumn, in the same chapel where they had first exchanged their vows nearly a year before, though this time the chapel overflowed with flowers, warm candlelight, and the presence of nearly every family from the county, drawn by curiosity that had long since transformed into genuine affection for the Duke and Duchess who had weathered such adversity and emerged stronger for it. Alara wore a gown of soft ivory, far removed from the somber dress she had worn on that first cold wedding day, and as she walked down the aisle toward Sebastian, she felt none of the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her a year before. Sebastian watched her approach with open, unguarded affection, his eyes bright with emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. When they exchanged their renewed vows, Sebastian's voice carried none of the flat, practiced tone of their first ceremony. Each word rang with sincerity, with a devotion that had been earned through months of quiet strength on Alara's part and hard-won growth on his own. "I once stood in this very chapel and offered you empty words," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. "Today, I offer you my whole heart, freely and completely. You are the truest partner I could have asked for, though I was too blind to see it when you first arrived. I promise to spend the rest of my days ensuring you never again doubt your place in my heart, or in this home." Alara, in turn, spoke of the strength she had found within herself during the loneliest months of their marriage, strength that had ultimately allowed her to build a life worth living regardless of Sebastian's initial indifference, and of the deep gratitude she felt that he had finally chosen to meet her there, in the life she had built, with an open heart rather than continued distance. The celebration that followed lasted long into the evening, filled with music and laughter that echoed through halls that had once known only cold silence. Mrs. Pemberton, watching from near the edge of the ballroom, wiped tears from her eyes as she observed the transformation of the household she had served for so many years. Mr. Grant raised a quiet toast among the staff to the Duchess, who had earned every ounce of the respect and affection now surrounding her. The Collier family, along with dozens of other tenant families, danced and celebrated among the county's finest, a testament to the bridges Alara had built between the manor and the lands it governed, bridges that Sebastian now walked alongside her rather than watching from a distance. Lady Amelia Prescott found Alara during a quiet moment in the celebration, embracing her warmly. I told you, did I not, that misery was a choice rather than a requirement. You have proven that beautifully, my dear. Look what patience and quiet strength have built for you. I could not have done it without people like you, willing to see me clearly from the start, Alara said, and the two women shared a smile that spoke of a friendship that had grown steadily since that first difficult evening at the Whitfield gathering. As the night wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Sebastian found Alara near the edge of the garden, away from the noise and light of the ballroom, standing beneath the same stars that had once watched over her loneliest nights within these walls. "Do you remember," he said, coming to stand beside her, "the first night you arrived here? You stood on these very steps, and I offered you nothing but coldness." "I remember," Alara said softly. "It feels like a different lifetime now." "It was a different lifetime," Sebastian said. "One I am deeply grateful has ended. I do not deserve the patience you showed me, Alara, but I intend to spend every day proving myself worthy of it nonetheless." "You already have," Alara said, turning to face him fully, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the manor's windows behind them, windows that now blazed with warmth and light rather than the cold darkness that had greeted her a year before. "Every day since the fire, since you finally chose to see me, you have proven it more than words ever could." Sebastian leaned down and kissed her then, gently and completely, a kiss that carried within it every unspoken apology, every quiet moment of growth, every ounce of love that had finally found its way to the surface after months buried beneath grief and misunderstanding. When they finally parted, Alara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a heart that had once seemed closed to her entirely and now belonged, fully and completely, to her alone. The manor behind them glowed with warm light, filled with music and laughter, and the presence of people who had once doubted the young Duchess, but now celebrated her with genuine joy. The cold, silent halls that had greeted Alara on her first night at Ashcombe Manor had transformed entirely, not through grand gestures or sudden change, but through the slow, steady accumulation of quiet strength, patient dignity, and a love that had grown stubbornly and beautifully despite every obstacle placed before it. As the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the celebration continued behind them, Sebastian took Alara's hand and led her back toward the light and warmth of their home, no longer a duty to be endured, but a life they had built together, chosen freely and cherished deeply. The unwanted Duchess finally and completely adored by the very man who had once refused to see her at all. 2 years passed at Ashcombe Manor, and the estate that had once stood cold and silent now hummed with a warmth that seemed to reach every corner of its halls. Sebastian and Alara had built, in that time, a partnership that extended far beyond the walls of their home, expanding the tenant welfare programs Alara had first begun quietly and without permission, transforming them into a model the neighboring estates soon sought to imitate. Mr. Grant had been promoted to full management of the estate's growing affairs, and Mrs. Pemberton had taken on a niece as her assistant, training her in the careful, warm hospitality that had come to define the manor under its new mistress. It was during the early spring of that second year that Alara discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled the manor with a quiet, joyful anticipation, unlike anything it had known in years. Sebastian's devotion to her deepened further during the months that followed, his protectiveness gentle rather than overbearing, his presence a steady comfort through the difficulties and discomforts that came with her condition. The birth itself, when it finally came in the depths of winter, arrived with complications no one had anticipated. Alara's labor stretched long into the night, far longer than the physician had expected, and by the early hours of the morning, exhaustion and pain had left her weaker than anyone in the manor cared to acknowledge aloud. Sebastian paced the hallway outside her chamber for hours, refusing every suggestion that he retire to his study or take rest elsewhere, his usual composure entirely abandoned in favor of raw, unguarded fear. "She is strong," Mrs. Pemberton told him gently, finding him near dawn still standing outside the door, his hands clasped tightly behind his back to hide their trembling. "She has faced far worse than this, Your Grace, and always with more grace than any of us deserved to witness. "I cannot lose her," Sebastian said quietly, the words carrying a depth of feeling he rarely allowed himself to voice so plainly. "Not after everything it took for me to finally see her clearly. Not now, when I have only just learned how to love her properly." It was shortly after sunrise that the physician finally emerged from the chamber, his expression tired but carrying the first flicker of good news Sebastian had dared to hope for through the long night. "Your Grace, you have a daughter. Both mother and child are weak, but they will recover fully with rest and care." Sebastian did not wait for further explanation before moving past the physician into the chamber, finding Alara pale but smiling weakly against her pillows, a small, swaddled bundle cradled carefully in her arms. He crossed the room quickly and knelt beside the bed, taking her free hand in both of his own, pressing it gently to his lips. "You frighten me terribly," he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "I am still here," Alara said softly, though exhaustion colored every word. "Come meet your daughter." Sebastian looked down at the small, sleeping face nestled against Alara's chest, and something within him, already softened so thoroughly over the past 2 years, opened completely at the sight of his child. "She is perfect," he said quietly. "What shall we name her?" Alara had considered this question through the long months of her pregnancy, and she answered without hesitation. "Grace," she said. "For everything this past year has taught us both." Sebastian nodded, tears he made no effort to hide slipping freely down his face as he pressed a gentle kiss to his daughter's forehead, then to Alara's. "Grace Ashcombe," he said softly. "A fitting name for a family that has learned its meaning so thoroughly." The following weeks brought a quiet, healing recovery for both mother and child, the manor settling into a new rhythm built around the small, precious addition to the family. Alara regained her strength steadily, spending long afternoons in the nursery with little Grace, while Sebastian, once so distant and unreachable, could hardly be persuaded to leave his daughter's side for more than an hour at a time, a devoted father in every sense the title carried. News of the birth spread quickly through the county and beyond, carried by the same channels that had once spread rumors of a cold, loveless marriage. This time, the news carried nothing but warmth and celebration, a reflection of how thoroughly the story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe had transformed in the eyes of everyone who had watched their journey unfold. Letters of congratulation arrived from families near and far, including a warm note from Lady Amelia Prescott, who insisted on visiting within the month to meet the newest addition to the family she had come to consider dear friends. The tenant families, too, celebrated the news with genuine joy, gathering near the manor gates on the day Alara first brought Grace outside for a gentle walk through the gardens, offering small gifts and warm wishes for the child who would one day inherit the very lands her mother had spent years tending with such quiet devotion. Hannah Collier, her own children now grown healthy and strong, brought a small handmade blanket for the infant, tears of happiness in her eyes as she recalled the young Duchess who had once carried firewood into her cottage with her own 2 hands. "She will grow up surrounded by love," Hannah said to Alara, watching as Sebastian walked a short distance away, cradling his daughter with a tenderness that still occasionally caught the estate's older residents by surprise, given how distant and cold the young Duke had once seemed. "That is a rare gift, my lady, and one you have built for her through your own strength." Alara watched her husband and daughter together, feeling a warmth settle deep within her chest, a quiet, complete happiness that felt entirely different from the loneliness that had once defined her earliest days at Ashcombe Manor. She thought back, sometimes, to that first cold arrival, the empty dinners, the silent halls, the husband who could not bring himself to look at her. She did not resent those memories any longer, understanding now that they had been necessary steps on a path that led, eventually, to the life she now lived, rich with purpose, respect, and genuine love. As the years continued to unfold, Ashcombe Manor became known throughout the region not for the cold distance that had once defined it, but for the warmth and generosity of its Duke and Duchess, whose partnership had grown only stronger with each passing season. Grace grew alongside a younger brother born 2 years later, both children raised within a household built on mutual respect, quiet strength, and a love that had been earned through hardship rather than granted freely from the start, and was, perhaps, all the more precious for having been so hard-won. Sebastian never forgot the lesson his marriage had taught him, that love built slowly, through patience and genuine effort, often grew deeper roots than affection offered too easily or too soon. He made it his quiet mission in the years that followed to ensure Alara never again doubted her place within his heart or his home, honoring her not with grand, empty gestures, but with the steady, daily devotion she had once shown him when he had given her nothing at all in return. And Alara, watching her children grow within the very halls that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming, understood fully the truth her mother had once shared with her, that dignity, held quietly and without complaint, could reshape a life far more powerfully than any protest or demand ever could. Her silence, once mistaken for weakness by a grieving husband too blind to see her clearly, had ultimately become the very foundation upon which their entire life together was built, a testament to patience, strength, and the quiet, unshakable belief that she deserved, eventually, to be truly and completely seen. The Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe lived out their years together in a home finally filled with warmth. Their story carried through the county for generations as proof that even the coldest beginnings could grow, in time, into something extraordinary, given patience, courage, and a willingness to let genuine love finally take root where indifference had once stood so stubbornly in its way.